we're going to be talking about a paper that we recently published on industry funding of patient organizations in the UK. So yes, let me just, okay. This is the structure for the presentation today, but let's get into the background of the paper. So starting with the definition of patient organizations, in the literature, they are defined as non-for-profit organizations that are composed of patients, caregivers, and that represent and support the needs of patients and caregivers. And they are important and widely recognized stakeholders in the drug development process. And mainly that is because they have first-hand experience on conditions. And among many other things, they can provide information, for example, on what it is like to live with a condition, how care is delivered, how that impacts them, their carers and families, and finally, how medicine and treatment can change their quality of life. And patient organizations are involved in pharmaceutical decision-making, and they interact on a daily basis with other stakeholders. And one example of them are pharmaceutical companies. So this figure, which is a bit overwhelming, but we're going to try to get through it, illustrate the scope of patient organizations' involvement across the drug development and commercialization timeline. In a sense, we just wanted to give you an understanding of how many activities these organizations are actually engaged with. So I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but just to give you an idea. So patient organization can help setting research priorities, and an example of that, they help identifying PROs in clinical trials. And on top of that, when it gets to the regulatory approval phase, they can share patients' views on benefit and risk of medicines. Similarly, in the HTA phase, they can help policymakers understanding the full value of a technology. And then finally, in the post-authorization phase, they engage in communication and advocacy activities. And these include, for example, disseminating results of clinical trials in the patient community. And on top of that, they can advocate for policy and legislative actions. So despite patient organization being active across a number of conditions, they are particularly important in the context of rare diseases, which in Europe are defined as conditions that affect less than, actually up to 5 people in 10,000. And these conditions are intrinsically different from non-rare ones, as they affect a small number of patients. They're usually genetically acquired, and on top of that, they usually tend to manifest in childhood. And just to give you a sense of how small the patient population is for this condition, the 6,000 rare diseases identified to date in the UK affect approximately 3 million people. And to compare with 4 million in the country suffers from diabetes and 7 from cardiovascular diseases. And so because of this, patient organization focusing on rare diseases were created to fill in the missing medical knowledge on these conditions, and they can facilitate access they can facilitate access to data needed to conduct clinical trials, and on top of that, they can advocate for legislative and policy attention. So a bit of historical context. So since the success of the HIV/AIDS advocacy campaigns, patient organizations have experienced an unprecedented involvement in health decision making. And specifically in the context of the UK, patient organizations have what we can call an established platform for formal engagement in both the regulatory and appraisal process. And an example of that is that the MHRA, for example, recently published their agenda for the next couple of years, and they put patients' involvement at the top of it. And furthermore, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, which is the UK HTA body, actively involved patients in its assessment. So this process actually got further momentum in 2020 when Baroness Julia Cambridge presented to the UK government an independent review that basically exposed how the UK has been neglecting patients' well-being in terms of safety and efficacy. And the review highlighted on top of that the need for patient organizations and patients in general to be a more vocal stakeholders in drugs development. And the idea for why that needs to be the case is that patients, since they are ultimately the final users of these products, they have to have a voice on their approval. And it's very interesting to do this presentation today because it's a very particular time for this topic, because after years of lobbying by patient advocates, the UK government is running a 6-week consultation that is currently open on the possibility of implementing a Sunshine Payment Act in the UK. Some of you might be aware what the Sunshine Act is in the US, which is basically a piece of legislation mandating companies, so in this case, pharmaceutical companies, to disclose all payments, both in terms of financial payments and in kind to healthcare providers. So basically this consultations opens up to the possibility of implementing legislation similar to this one in the UK. And on top of that, in the consultation, there's also a question inquiring whether the government should mandate the disclosure of information about patient payments also to patient organizations. It's obvious, as if we're all aligned with that point. So if you do care about this and you want to get informed, you can go online and participate to the consultation, which is going to close in a few weeks from now. So this is just a small parenthesis on how hot this topic is at the moment. So the existing literature on patient organizations. So the papers that have been published so far have focused on a number of different topics, and these include the large number and high value payments from industry to patient organizations, and the uneven distribution between therapeutic areas, and then finally the concentration of payments coming from a small number of companies and the concordance between companies' marketed drugs and contributions to patient organizations. So, however, we felt that the concordance of companies and patient organizations' interests have not been fully explored in the UK, and the only existing study focuses on drugs on the market only, so it failed to include drugs that are still in the R&D pipeline. And then finally, all the papers that I mentioned above focus on patient organizations overall, and they don't tease out the difference that might be in the financial relationship between rare and non-rare patient organizations. As we've discussed before, we think that they might behave differently. So what is the research questions of our paper? So the main one is, what is the concordance between the commercial interests of pharmaceutical companies and patient organization activities? And the sub-questions for this are about the general dynamics of this relationship, looking at the top funders and the most funded disease areas, and then what is the concentration of industry funding. And we have a few measures on how we estimate concentration. And then finally, for all the questions above, we investigated whether there were differences between rare and non-rare diseases. Okay. So going to the methodology. So the methodology is going to be divided in 4 sections. So in the first part, we have collected data on industry payments, followed by data on patient organization receiving industry payments. Then we assessed whether companies had a commercial interest in the disease area targeted by the patient organization. And finally, we assessed industry funding concentration. So starting with data on industry payment, we collected data on payment made from pharmaceutical companies to patient organizations in 2020 from the websites of these companies, disclosing, just as a note, disclosing payments to patient organization, doctors, and other stakeholders is a requirement of the ABPI Code of Practice. And all companies sign up to abide by the ABPI Code of Practice, accept the jurisdiction of the PMCPA, which is the code regulators, and essentially it extends beyond also members of the ABPI, and it is expected that most companies operative in the UK comply with this regulation. Of course, it's going to be discussed as one of the limitations. I'm not going to be focusing on that. And just to conclude in this part, all payments were converted to pounds in case they were not in this currency, and they're all in 2020 GBP then. So as a second step, what we did is we screened patient organizations' websites to understand the condition or conditions that they focused on. And we translated this into ICD-11 codes using the WHO International Classification of Disease database. And for example, we have an example here in the slide. So in the case of Blood Cancer UK, for example, on their website, they say that their mission is to beat blood cancer. Therefore, we coded the condition targeted as ICD-11 code 2A, which is neoplasm and of hematopoietic or lymphoid tissues. And after being identified as described above, what we did is that we further classified patient organizations into rare, non-rare ones. So conditions were considered rare if they appeared in the Orphanet database of rare diseases, regardless of their classification level. And for example, multiple myeloma appears in this database, and therefore a patient organization targeting this condition in our analysis would be categorized as rare focused. So and then similarly, for example, another example that we have is Metabolic Support UK. For example, in this case, it's not specific to any specific rare condition, but on the website, they say that their objective is to fight rare diseases, and therefore these could also be categorized as a rare disease patient organization. On the other hand, if a patient organization focuses on a broader condition, which in this case could be blood cancer, but has no sole focus on a rare condition, the organization would be conservatively considered non-rare. And then finally, a third category was created for non-disease specific patient organizations. And these can include, for example, coalition of charities and or organizations focused on palliative care. So then we developed a methodology to assess the extent to which a pharmaceutical company holds an interest in the disease targeted by a patient organizations. And for the purpose of this analysis, we adapted the definition of interest provided by NICE, which says that an interest is when there is or could be perceived to be an opportunity for a pharmaceutical company to benefit in the disease area where the patient organization operates. And this could include, for example, situations where the pharmaceutical company has a drug developed or in development for a condition targeted by the patient organization, or where a drug in the company's portfolio or pipeline is restricted to a specific population affected by the disease targeted by the patient organization. This is a bit cumbersome, but hopefully it will become clear down the line. So to do that, we screened companies' annual reports, website and clinicaltrial.gov database to assess whether a company had an interest in the condition targeted by the patient organization receiving the payment. So very briefly, this is just kind of a mapping algorithm that we've used to guide our the definition of interest that a company has in a patient organization. So just looking at the first couple of boxes, if you go back to the example that we had before, which was blood cancer, which is a higher level, which is a lower level of ICD code. And bear in mind that higher just mean more specific. And in this case, blood cancer is not specific enough for us to be able to attribute that to a definitely yes. So if, for example, if a company makes a payment to a specific blood cancer, to Blood Cancer UK, but they have one drug in development for a specific blood cancer, we are not going to be able to assess the perfect concordance between the scope of the patient organizations and the disease of the disease targeted by the drug of the company. So it wouldn't be a definitely yes, but it would be a probably yes. On the other hand, if a patient organization is focusing on multiple myeloma and a company has a drug in development for the same condition, we would be able to match the diseases, and in this case there would be a perfect concordance. So in that case, it would be a definite yes. Of course, if it's none of these two, it would be a no. And then finally, as concentration of industry has only been spread in a few countries, we explored how many companies funded each patient organization, what is the share of industry contributions coming from the main funder, and this means how much is the main funder accounting for compared to the overall industry contributions. And then following on the point above, we also calculated what is the share of industry's contribution coming from the highest payments received over the study period, which is 2020. So I'm done with the methodology, so I'm happy to pass over to Eva, who will walk you through the results.
Yes, thank you. So I'll try to be very brief so that we have time for more Q&A. So quickly, just the general dynamics, what we saw when we started looking into the data. In 2020, we found that 74 companies made 1,422 payments to 341 organizations, and that amounted to over 22.5 million pounds. There were differences in the median payments for rare, non-rare focused patient organizations, but those are quite minimal, with non-rare focused patient organizations having a higher median payment. And then next, we also looked at the distribution of funding across funders, and we saw that the top 3 funders were Pfizer, Novo Nordisk, and UCB. And you can see in this graph and a graph that I'll be presenting shortly that we kind of separated the patient organizations into rare focused, non-rare focused, and non-disease specific. So if at any point the percentages when I'm talking about rare and non-rare don't add up to 100, it's because the remaining goes to non-disease specific patient organizations. So here, yes, the next thing we looked at was the commercial interests, and what we found is that 90% of the value of payments went to organizations that were aligned with companies' portfolios or pipelines. And in terms of volume, that was represented by 85%. So what do I mean by this here is sort of payments that we could code as either definitely yes or probably yes. So there was at least somewhat of an alignment in the interests of the company paying and the organization receiving the money. When we looked at disease-specific organizations, so rare and non-rare, this went to 97%. So 97% of the value of all payments going to disease-specific patient organizations could be attributed to companies that were aligned or organizations that were aligned to the commercial interests of the companies. In terms of volume, if we just look at rare and non-rare, we determined that companies definitely had an interest in 56% of payments, definitely had an interest for 56% of the payments directed to rare organizations and 54% of the payments directed to non-rare patient organizations, but we couldn't find any significance in this difference. And then we did the same for value, and we established that there was a definite interest for 67% of the payments to rare-focused organizations and 59% of payments to non-rare focused organizations. And I know there's a lot of numbers, but really what you could think, what the takeaway here is that the alignment of interest, the definite alignment of interest was higher for rare focused organizations than non-rare ones. And we also found this difference to be statistically significant. And you can go to the next slide. Thank you. And we also looked at, as the focus of the paper really was to establish the difference between rare and non-rare focused patient organizations, we decided to look at sort of more of a breakdown of the data and realize and kind of see what is going on when we look at rare and non-rare focused patient organizations separately. And as expected, much less of the overall value of payments to patient organizations was going to rare disease focused patient organizations than to non-rare ones. And that was 21% for rare and 70% for non-rare ones. We also found that the top 3 recipients, the top 3 funded patient organizations were the European Association for the Study of Obesity, which received about 1.5 million. It was followed by the Epilepsy Society, receiving just under £1 million, and Shift MS, which received just under 600,000. So these were all non-rare focused patient organizations, and only one in the top 10 funded patient organizations was in fact rare, and that was Cystic Fibrosis Trust. But it's also worth noting that Blood Cancer UK scored 7th on this list, and some of the cancers which it focuses on are also rare. What we found, and this is illustrated very well in the next slide, when we looked at specific disease areas, we found that irrespective of the rarity of the disease, the top 3 most funded disease areas, which in this case are the diseases of the nervous system, neoplasms, and endocrine, nutritional, and metabolic diseases, make up more than half of all industry funding. So they received combined 57% of all payments sent to patient organizations. And out of these 3, the endocrine, nutritional, and metabolic diseases group has the highest share of rare patient organizations, which we link to this ICD. They also received the highest share of money for rare. What we also found is that after looking at ICD, we then looked at a lower level. We looked at diseases, specific diseases, and what we found is that the non-rare conditions that attracted the most funding included multiple sclerosis, followed by diabetes and epilepsy. And then in terms of rare diseases, the biggest recipients of funding were cystic fibrosis, primary immunodeficiencies, and lysosomal storage diseases. So this is all on the therapeutic areas. Thank you. Then we also looked at industry funding concentration, and here it gets a bit convoluted. And we essentially, as Arianna has already explained, we looked at the dependency of patient organizations from one payment or one company as a share of total industry funding. We couldn't look at total overall funding due to certain data limitations with the Charity Commission income data, which we would be more than happy to talk about all of our data challenges later in the Q&A. So what we found here is that each patient organization, I hope that this is, yeah, so this is just not the, I'm sorry, there's a mistake here, and it's approximately one company, not 2 companies. So we found that each patient organization received payment on average from one company, and there wasn't significant difference between rare and non-rare patient organizations. We found that the median company contribution to rare-focused patient organizations comprised 30% of their overall funding versus 23% for non-rare patient organizations. So again, here, while we already know that rare-focused patient organizations receive less money and there's fewer payments directed to them, they are of higher, they are normally larger payments as a share of overall industry funding. And this is also demonstrated by my next point, which is the fact that the single highest payment to patient organizations amounted to an average of 67.5% of overall payments, which was ranging between 8.5 to a maximum of 100%. But when this is broken down into rare and non-rare focused patient organizations, we actually found that that single highest payment for rare was over 70%, which is quite high compared to 62.5 for non-rare patient organizations. And I will quickly go through our limitations, although I hope that some of you will, I'm sure that some of you will bring other limitations that might have skipped our minds. So the biggest limitation for any study like this that uses voluntary disclosure data is the data availability and the quality of the data. Although disclosing such payments is part of the ABPI code, which companies should abide by, there is very little enforcement, and so there is also not that much compliance in terms of mandatory reporting. There is also a problem of underreporting and misreporting. So underreporting of the value and the volume of the payments, but also misreporting the payments. It was pointed to us during our writing process that in fact, some of the payments to patient organizations are not coded as payments to patient organizations. They're in fact coded as payments to healthcare organizations. So they're not even in the same platform as other payments. And that obviously gives us a very skewed idea and hinders transparency greatly. And then another big issue is that all of these disclosure reports, which contain information about payments in terms of the value, but also the description of the payments, any information, is removed from the public domain after 3 years. So this creates a huge barrier to any interested party, media, policymakers, academics. It doesn't really matter. If you start working on this now, you will only be able to find data up to 2019, I think, or 2020. So this is obviously one of the really big issues. And in comparison, other countries where there is such disclosure reports that are made public, such as France, for example, which has a Sunshine Act, they are left in public domain indefinitely. And another limitation of our study is that we obviously only focused on 1 year. This is partially due to data unavailability. And so because of that, we cannot really guarantee that the trends we find and report on are generalizable to other periods. And you can, yes, thank you. Thank you. And I'll briefly just walk you through some of the conclusions that we reached, and we can start our discussion. So what we found was that almost all industry payments during our study period, in terms of both volume, again, 85% of the volume, and by the volume, again, I mean the number of payments, and the value of the payments, 90%, were directed to patient organizations aligned with the pharmaceutical companies' portfolios and pipelines. So they were aligned with their commercial interests. And despite rare diseases affecting only 5% of the UK population, as Arianna mentioned at the beginning, more than 20% of all reported industry payments in 2020 were in fact directed to rare-focused patient organizations. And there are many reasons, and we can speculate why that is the case, but the commercial attractiveness of such conditions surely plays some sort of a role in the choices that companies make when choosing who to fund. No, can you go back to, yeah. No, it's fine. Actually, that's fine. Go. I'm sorry. You can go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. So lastly, the rare conditions that attracted the most funding are actually also quite highly prevalent diseases. So for example, cystic fibrosis and multiple myeloma. To see our entire data set, and you can sort of track different diseases, disease groups, and specific diseases or specific patient organizations, you can have a look at our paper and the supplemental material, and you'll find more detailed information there. But all of these diseases which attracted a lot of funding, they're highly prevalent diseases, even though they're rare. And for these, multiple therapeutic alternatives already exist. So this sort of creates the risk for widening inequities in drug availability and drug development. We also believe that particular attention should be paid to payments which are made immediately before or after endorsements of products, which has been, recently there was a case with a non-rare condition with an obesity drug called Wegovy, developed by Novo Nordisk in the UK, which was quite an interesting case. And we wrote an opinion piece in the BMJ, which I would be happy to share with you in the chat later, talking about the problems of conflicts of interest, especially in cases like this, in cases where the payment has been made shortly after or before the endorsement. And lastly, the patient organizations focusing on rare diseases are funded by very few companies, and they rely on really high single payments in terms of their overall industry funding. So this can create even higher dependencies on companies. What we believe can happen here is that government support can be used to secure, to avoid over-reliance on industry funding and all the biases and conflicts of interest that can arise from that. And with that, thank you. And I hope that we'll have time to discuss this.
Excellent. Thank you so much for very interesting research, very timely research. There's a lot of interest now in this particular question, actually, with the consultation. And thank you for bringing it up. So please, the floor is open to questions. Turn on your cameras, raise your hands to ask questions. I'll begin while we're waiting for some volunteers. Very interesting findings I found by therapeutic areas that you presented, and linking this to companies' interests and portfolios. And the thing that was in my head is obviously drug pricing as well, because these are the therapeutic areas with the highest priced medicines, with a lot of money circulating. And you raised a question about rare diseases, pointing it was cystic fibrosis and multiple myeloma, also having one of the most expensive drugs on the market. And even with smaller populations, we're dealing with very high costs. So that would be an interesting line to explore as well, in terms of volume of payments and prices of drugs for your postdocs or some other PhD. So yes, please, looking forward to questions from the floor. David, please go ahead.
I was struck by the conditions thing. It could do with normalizing in some way, though, couldn't it? Neurological disease is bound to be big because there's an awful lot of it around, and very little can be done about most of it. So that's bound to be big. But if it was normalized by the frequency of the condition or something like that, you could get slightly different information from it, perhaps.
Eva, do you want to take this?
I'm happy to give the very sort of brief answer, and then maybe you can add something. But I think the problem that we saw, again, everything was very much about the data, in the sense that for some of the patient organizations, it's very hard to find a specific disease that they might be interested in. So we kind of left them at a higher ICD code rather than a specific condition. And so because of that, this is the sort of the most detailed picture that we'll get. And then the more detailed we get, the more we're losing out on certain observations, as we're not able to pinpoint which specific condition they target. But yes, I'm sure that you're absolutely right. And the more detailed, if we were able to go in a more in a more detailed way, perhaps some of the things would be shifting.
And if I can add just one thing, I think we decided to focus on absolute values in terms of monetary payments, because it was first, from a data collection point, the easiest way forward, but it was also, we believe, the most conservative approach, in a sense that if we were to normalize that based on, for example, prevalence, I think the picture that we would be seeing is that as is kind of the thing that we've done at the end. So where we show that despite affecting so few patients at the end of the day, there is basically more than 20% devoted to this condition. But yeah, completely agree with your point and take it. We could have done so many things, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
We have a question from Zara. Please go ahead.
Hi, this was a really interesting talk. I just wanted to ask you, I remember one of you said that you have an idea that the donations, contributions, however you would name them, from pharma companies to patient organizations that were rare versus non-rare, you expected there to be a difference. And I was just wondering, like, why did you expect there to be a difference? I have some of my own ideas, but I'm just curious to know why you guys.
Oh, so I think maybe you're saying this in relation to, I think I said as expected when referring to the difference. Well, what I was talking about was the, I think I said it in relation to the amount of money spent on rare versus non-rare, just because non-rare, focused patient organizations deal with conditions which are just much more prevalent, just because of the number, really.
The interesting thing with rare diseases, though, is like you showed on one of your slides, collectively, all rare diseases, there are actually a lot of patients with rare diseases. It's just each rare disease has obviously not many patients, but I was just curious to know why you, because I mean, really technically, like, rare diseases do actually affect like a lot of people. It's just,
I think you're absolutely, so they do affect quite a lot of people, but in relative terms, what we tried to also show at the beginning of the presentation is that if you take all people who are affected by rare diseases in the UK, that is about 3 million people. And in comparison, there are 4 million people who are affected by diabetes alone. So yes, while overall rare diseases do affect quite a few people, there are conditions which are non-rare, which are just more prevalent.
Diabetes is considered really common, right? And it's only 25% more in the UK. So I was surprised by those numbers because to me, that looked like they were quite similar.
So they are similar, and you're absolutely right. And I think we're also trying to kind of tease that out a bit more, in the sense that rare diseases, while they don't really affect collectively, they don't really affect that many people, again, in relative terms, they're very commercially attractive for a lot of pharmaceutical companies. So
because they can charge really high prices for them.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
And if I can just add one thing, I think you're completely right about also, I mean, there are some different tractions that we can imagine, like the prevalence one, as we were discussing before. It is intuitive that diseases that affect 300 people in a country might not be able to do a race for the cure, because there's not going to be enough people attend, like the money that, like, the public awareness that they can generate is limited. But on the other hand, it's also true that rare diseases benefit from not being stigmatized diseases, in a sense that, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I've read a few papers on how some types of cancer are perceived and receive money and donations in a different way because are associated with bad behaviors of people getting sickness, and rare conditions affect kids often because they're genetically acquired. So like these two forces kind of go in the opposite directions, but at the end of the day, the prevalence bit seems to prevail. And also we have not even started talking about how much you can charge for these medicines to get back your investments. But that is a whole different conversation. But thanks.
Can I just add one other thing I'm loosely aware of that you might know about? So I'm aware of a company, they don't consider themselves a pharma company, but they work with pharma companies, and they are creating like a training program for patient organizations, patient advocates, to get them aware of how to take advantage of early access programs. And I was just wondering, just from me explaining it like that, I don't know if that's really enough information, but since hearing about it, I've struggled to really understand how that company commercially benefits from doing that. But I know that they must do, because they're not even charging for the training, like it's free. And obviously a pharma company benefits because, you know, if there's an early access program and people can get access to their drug, then they can charge, you know, the health system a lot of money. But I don't know if you're aware of that, or if you've got any ideas about, you know, the kind of the commercial angle there, just because this is your field, I'm guessing you might kind of have an understanding that I don't about that.
I'm not aware of the specific initiative that you're talking about. I usually, when it's about early access programs, the difference is who is paying for the treatments, because most of the times, as far as I'm aware, it's companies, and they just pay a few rounds of treatment before the drugs get approved, and that can be seen in many different ways. But one way of seeing that could be kind of a marketing fidelization exercise, where you just give access to patients in need, and then you build also a desire from that population to push from
So it's
an advocacy perspective to make sure that drug is approved. But I'm not aware of the details. So if you have any link, please pop it in the chat.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Zara. And Barbara, please, the floor is yours. And you just posted a comment as well. So maybe you can continue.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe related. First, I wanted just to say thank you. Really impressive study, and very impressive also just in terms of all the detail you provided about how to establish the same commercial space, because I understand how complicated that is. I was interested in some of the concentration that you had described in terms of the funding from specific companies. And with Novo Nordisk, you've discussed the issue of really that massive promotional pressure for first liraglutide for obesity and then semaglutide more recently. I'm wondering, because I noticed Pfizer was top of the list, I'm wondering whether there also are drugs being considered by NICE right now that might explain why they were so high on the list. And also just in general, whether you had seen a relationship between the companies that were giving the most funding and reimbursement decisions that were under discussion.
I mean, this is a great question, and it's something that we don't have a direct answer right now, but it is something that we have also thought about and we're thinking about. But in the case of the Novo Nordisk the semaglutide and the Novo Nordisk marketing of Wegovy, there is a lot of different aspects that are really interesting, and I will also link this to one of the questions that was asked in the chat by Deborah. It's not just the concentration is such an interesting topic, and it's such an interesting aspect of pharmaceutical marketing, and unfortunately is not considered in regulatory decision making. So during NICE appraisals, for example, this is not something that is being taken into account. Normally, patient organizations are just asked to declare any funding that they've received in the past 12 months without any contextualization of that funding in terms of what share of their overall, not even just industry funding, because what we were talking about here is concentration as a share of overall industry funding, not total funding. And that is because so in the UK, patient organizations declare their income in the charity commissions, and a lot of them don't declare it on time. And unfortunately, in a lot of them, the data that is declared does not allow you to break it down into government funding, industry funding, and private donations, like small donations and so on. And so it's actually very difficult to, one, check the disclosures, the company disclosures, and to really understand what is the overall share of like how dependent are they on this one company.
No, I understand. And just as an anecdote, we did an analysis of the Australian payments and found that I think we're looking over a 4-year period, and the Macular Disease Foundation was getting the most money, actually from 2 different companies that had drugs that were coming back again and again for discussion over reimbursement. So that had been refused several times and were eventually approved. So just an anecdote, but certainly, similar probable patterns.
Yeah. It's very, very interesting to kind of see the disclosure forms. I mean, what was very interesting, and this is something that we kind of wanted to include as part of the opinion piece that we wrote in the BMJ, but decided not to the end. To publish an opinion piece in the BMJ, we had to disclose 3 years of any conflicts of interest. To participate in a NICE appraisal hearing for a drug, we need to disclose 12 months. And that's just a bit confusing.
Thank you so much. Eric, please go ahead with your question.
Yes, I don't have any questions. It's just some comments. So publications of work like this are both helpful and unhelpful, because I think there's a lot of context that's missing. I've been working with patient organizations for the best part of 30 years. And in various guises, all over the world have had lots of collaborations with companies, and the patient groups that I've been involved in have received lots of money from companies. And apart from on 1 or 2 occasions, I can't remember a time where there was any hint of inappropriateness or any collusion or persuasion or expectation that we as patient organizations would do anything for the company. Now, that's not to say that I haven't seen bad practice on all sides, but there's a lot of really, really good examples of great patient and industry collaboration. And it's very, very, I find it very difficult to get money out of the pharmaceutical industry. They're so nervous and so cautious and so risk adverse with working with patient organizations. It's extremely difficult to get money from industry. And they're very nervous about having any interactions at all with kind of patients. So I think some context is really, really important. And I agree with many things that have been said and many things in the paper. there needs to be more transparency, there needs to be more disclosures. All of that stuff is so critical and so important. And I think people would appreciate that and welcome it. Patient organizations especially, I think, for the most part, would welcome all of this to be open, transparent, and published, because I think a lot of them are somewhat tired of hearing how the implication that just because a patient organization would take funding from a company that is necessarily a bad thing and that there's bias in collusion. And that is not the whole reality. So I think work like this is really important as a contribution to the debate. It doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't give all of the context. As you guys said, there are limitations of that study that you probably haven't picked up on. I can share them with you offline. So I think it's an important contribution, but we need to also talk about context.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll be
Thanks,
quiet,
Eric.
but just some feedback.
I think we completely get your point, and that is 100% true, in a sense that, and also you mentioned it yourself at the end, the objective of this is not to advocate against, and I hoped, but maybe we have not succeeded in our paper to make it very objective, that we do not place the fault or the blame, or we don't assume any misbehavior from patient organizations, but we just advocate for transparency, and the same way that has been done for doctors, because the same way I'm convinced many doctors get paid by pharmaceutical industry might not be influenced in how they prescribe medicine. I mean, some people might differ, but that is not what we're arguing. We're just arguing that in that context, first, we do not think that it's the best way to go for patient organization to solely rely on industry funding, but that's not because of patient organizations. Of course, you have a duty to provide services to the patient community that you're engaging with. And of course, if the only source of money comes from there, you're going to go there.
Yeah,
so
and I would you're absolutely right. And I think that there's a lot of improvement that patient organizations should do to help themselves. So they shouldn't be over-reliant on one company. The total income from pharmaceutical companies shouldn't be more than 10 or 15%. It should be part of a diverse portfolio of income, et cetera, et cetera. These are all really, really important things. And patient organizations need more help to understand that for sure. Absolutely.
And also, one thing that we have advocated for in our opinion piece that Eva just mentioned is, on top of involving patients, what we can do is try to increase the diversity of voices of patients contributing to NICE appraisals and MHRA appraisals. So in a sense that if we have more people on the table, it's not to say that conflict of interest disappear, but might be balanced on some way. And we just want to find a collective solution. We don't want to polarize the debate on right or wrong, bad people and good people. So it's we have a common objective, which is to care for patients. And I'm strongly convinced about that. So the objective is the same, but we can decide how we build the way to lead us there, if that makes sense. But Eva, feel free to jump in if I forgot anything.
I understand.
No, I echo everything that you said, and I think I just wanted to say that the case with Novo Nordisk that we were talking about, I think what we found very interesting, because you yourself mentioned that, perhaps industry funding shouldn't go beyond 10 to 15%. And again, this does not, it is not up to the patient organizations to decide. When there is not enough government funding for certain organizations, there has to be a substitute for that. But what we had found is that across certain years, patient organizations who supported the appraisal of the Wegovy drug, they were receiving up to 80% of their funding from the manufacturer, which is a substantial amount.
Yeah, no,
And again-
and that's a good example. And just, it might be helpful. In my experience of doing nice appraisals for 20 years, I don't believe any contribution, and Lisa, I know you disagree with me, representing the patient has made any difference to the NICE decision. The most success I've had in HT is persuading the company to give a bigger discount. You know, so that's another important part of the kind of context, that good patient advocacy doesn't just focus on lobbying NICE, it focuses on actually getting the company to do the right things at the right time. You know, so anyway, I think we're all saying the same thing, but I think these bigger things need to come out as that message that we're asking for transparency and best practice. We're not sort of like pointing fingers at people.
Great. Thank you very much for this discussion and very important contextual information. Just one quick comment that it is very, very difficult for patient organizations to source funding outside of industry. And obviously industry fills the gap that they see. And this is a big call for policymakers. If they want something changed, they should really think of structures where patient organizations can have alternative sources as well. Adriane, thank you very much for raising your hand. I actually had a question for you, so please feel free to comment and ask questions from the others, but because this will be the last question, we have to wrap up. My quick question to you would have been about the Sunshine Act in America and whether it made any difference in terms of policies and behaviors, because my feeling is it's up there. You can go and check any clinician, and they continue to receive payments and have a big volume of patients, so to speak. So, so please go ahead with your common questions and potential positives, pros and cons for the implementation of Sunshine Act in the UK.
Sure. Thanks so much for doing this great paper. And Joel Lexchin and I have written an article on just that question of the Sunshine Act, and really it hasn't, it's made a difference in terms of researchers being able to use that material to document things, but in terms of actually making a difference in terms of conflicts of interest, it has not made a difference. And I also just wanted to say with patient advocacy groups that pharma doesn't fund things that don't help it. And any patient advocacy organization that's taking money from pharma is going to be prevented from saying negative things about those drugs. It's not just backing particular drugs that they're looking for. They're also buying silence on drug harms, on drug prices, on that sort of thing. So, you know, organizations do not have to take money from pharmaceutical companies, and we're one of the only groups that's working on these more covert methods of promotion, and patient advocacy groups have become more and more important to pharmaceutical companies, very effective in the media, in affecting regulators, in affecting legislators. Yeah, I mean, of course, nobody thinks that they're being influenced by industry money, but you are.
Oh, that's quite tough to listen to. I think I've been one of the biggest public critics of the pharmaceutical industry in all four, you know, so that's just not true.
Well, we've got a lot of resources on our site documenting these things. So I just advise people to look at farmedout.org and read some of our materials.
I'll do that.
Very important issues that have been raised, and Adriane, maybe you should come to Consilium and give a talk and explain the work that you have done. So the truth lies somewhere in between. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Industry helps in many ways to support many of these organizations which would not exist otherwise, but conflict of interest is there. So the question is it exploited or is it not? And how we can move forward, especially when it comes to decision making.